In a world where constant noise shapes every thought you have, what happens when you finally step away from it? Welcome to Relaxing Facts Studio. Today, we explore how silence, solitude, and independent thinking quietly reshape the way the human brain processes reality, from stress chemistry to deep creative insight. You'll see how simple actions like walking alone or disconnecting from digital validation can trigger powerful changes in attention, emotion, and decision-making. Nothing here is abstract theory, only observable science and real biological systems working beneath everyday life. Let's break down what happens when the mind is left truly uninterrupted. People often solve difficult problems only after they stop talking about them. A long walk without conversation reduces the constant stream of reactions, opinions, and interruptions that normally shape thinking into familiar patterns. The brain starts noticing connections it ignored earlier. This effect becomes stronger during repetitive movement, especially walking at a steady pace for more than 20 minutes. Researchers studying divergent thinking found that walking can increase idea generation compared to sitting still. The shift looks simple. The neurological change underneath it is not. That change begins when external coordination decreases and internal processing takes over. Constant collaboration forces the brain to predict social responses, a process linked to activity in the prefrontal cortex and social monitoring networks. Solo walking reduces that demand. At the same time, rhythmic left-right body movement increases communication between brain hemispheres through cross-hemispheric activation. This synchronization improves mental flexibility and pattern recombination. In practical terms, unrelated memories and observations become easier to connect. A quiet sidewalk can trigger more original thinking than an hour inside a crowded meeting room. Those connections become even stronger when stimulation disappears completely. The brain contains a system called the default mode network, which becomes active when focused external attention fades. During silent solitary movement, this network begins linking distant memories, unfinished thoughts, and unresolved problems beneath conscious awareness. The process consumes enormous biological resources. Even at rest, the human brain uses roughly 20% of the body's energy while weighing only about 3 pounds. That hidden activity explains why breakthrough insights often appear during showers, late-night walks, or silent drives instead of active work sessions. Because of this, constant digital input can quietly block deep problem solving before it fully forms. Music, podcasts, notifications, and rapid conversation keep the brain locked in reactive processing instead of internal synthesis. Some cognitive researchers describe uninterrupted silence as a no-input state, because it removes competing signals long enough for subconscious integration to stabilize. The effect resembles clearing static from a radio transmission. Without interruption, the mind stops recycling familiar ideas and starts building entirely new structures from existing information. People check notifications long before they consciously decide to. A single like, comment, or message triggers a small reward response that trains the brain to seek repeated social approval. Over time, digital platforms stop feeling like tools and start functioning like behavioral conditioning systems. The cycle becomes automatic. Researchers studying dopamine-driven reward loops found that unpredictable feedback schedules increase compulsive checking behavior far more effectively than consistent rewards. That uncertainty keeps attention locked onto platforms even when users no longer enjoy the experience itself. That dependency weakens when decision-making shifts inward instead of outward. People who rely primarily on personal reasoning spend less mental energy scanning for consensus before forming conclusions. This reduces social reward sensitivity inside neural systems linked to approval seeking, especially within the ventral striatum and prefrontal evaluation networks. The change affects behavior quickly. Independent thinkers often pause longer before reacting because they filter information through internal logic rather than crowd momentum. As a result, emotional contagion spreads through them more slowly during outrage cycles, trend waves, or coordinated online reactions. That resistance creates problems for systems built on prediction. Recommendation algorithms depend on stable behavioral patterns, repeated emotional triggers, and highly consistent engagement habits. Most users eventually become statistically predictable through clicks, pauses, purchases, and viewing duration. Independent behavior disrupts that process. A person who suddenly changes interests, ignores viral trends, or disappears from platforms for days generates weaker identity profiles. Large-scale behavioral targeting systems rely on pattern continuity. Unpredictable users reduce algorithmic confidence in the same way irregular weather complicates satellite forecasting. That disruption matters because modern digital systems process human behavior at enormous scale. Major recommendation platforms analyze billions of interactions daily to estimate attention patterns, emotional preferences, and future engagement probability. The system continuously adapts. Machine learning models compare users against massive behavioral clusters, often predicting interests before conscious decisions fully form. Yet cognitive autonomy weakens that influence. People who intentionally filter information, limit reactive scrolling, and separate identity from online approval create fewer stable feedback loops. In a hyper-connected environment, psychological independence increasingly depends on controlling attention before algorithms learn to control it first. People behave differently the moment nobody is watching them. During solitary walking, the brain gradually stops monitoring facial expressions, tone of voice, posture, and social reactions, freeing cognitive resources normally used for self-presentation. This process is called social self-monitoring, and it consumes more mental energy than most people realize. The effect appears quickly. After several minutes alone, attention often shifts away from imagined judgment and toward physical surroundings, internal thoughts, and sensory detail that normally stay buried beneath social awareness. That shift changes electrical activity inside the brain itself. Repetitive movement and reduced stimulation can gradually move the mind away from fast, stress-heavy beta wave activity and toward calmer alpha and theta patterns associated with reflection and relaxed attention. The transition does not happen instantly. A steady walking rhythm acts almost like a metronome for neural timing, lowering cognitive fragmentation and stabilizing attention. This is one reason many people report clearer thinking during long walks than during active multitasking, even when processing the same problem. As mental noise decreases, sensory processing becomes dramatically more vivid. Sounds feel sharper, distances appear more noticeable, and small environmental details suddenly gain clarity because attentional resources are no longer dominated by social filtering systems. The brain constantly edits reality to conserve energy. Under normal conditions, it discards enormous amounts of sensory information every second. During isolated movement, some of that filtering relaxes. A quiet street can begin to feel unusually detailed, almost like increasing the resolution on a digital display after removing visual compression. That heightened awareness also explains why solitary walking often restores emotional clarity after overstimulation. Continuous notifications, crowded environments, and non-stop decision-making overload stress regulation systems linked to the amygdala and autonomic nervous system. The brain struggles to process unresolved input while new stimulation keeps arriving. Solitary movement interrupts that accumulation cycle. Researchers sometimes describe the effect as a neurological reset because repetitive low-intensity motion helps regulate emotional overload while restoring attentional balance. The result is not escape from reality. It is a temporary return to processing reality with less interference. People often crave isolation at specific times without fully understanding why. Late evenings, early mornings, or periods after intense social exposure can trigger a strong desire to withdraw from conversation and stimulation. The pattern is biological before it becomes emotional. Inside the body, cellular timing systems called circadian rhythms regulate far more than sleep. They influence hormone release, emotional stability, cognitive energy, digestion, and attention levels across roughly 24-hour cycles. Even small disruptions can change how the nervous system responds to social environments. That disruption becomes more severe when stimulation never fully stops. Continuous conversations, notifications, artificial lighting, and digital exposure force the brain to process incoming information long after its recovery systems should begin slowing down. The nervous system accumulates unresolved cognitive residue. Researchers studying sensory saturation found that excessive input increases mental fatigue because the brain keeps partially processing unfinished stimuli in the background. The effect resembles leaving dozens of browser tabs open simultaneously. Energy remains divided even when attention appears focused on a single task. As that overload builds, the body starts shifting toward temporary isolation as a recovery mechanism. Solitude supports parasympathetic regulation, hormonal stabilization, and synaptic recalibration by reducing the volume of incoming sensory demands. This process affects the entire nervous system. Cortisol levels, attentional control, and emotional regulation all depend partly on whether the brain receives uninterrupted periods of reduced stimulation. The human circadian system evolved under predictable cycles of daylight, darkness, movement, and silence. Modern digital environments extend stimulation far beyond those natural biological limits every single day. Because of this, structured solitude may function less like avoidance and more like biological maintenance. Constant connectivity disrupts internal synchronization between sleep cycles, stress chemistry, and attentional recovery systems, especially under prolonged digital exposure. The brain struggles to distinguish meaningful signals from endless low-priority input. Intentional isolation interrupts that overload long enough for regulatory systems to stabilize again. A quiet walk at sunrise or an hour without screens can restore measurable calm faster than many people expect because the nervous system finally stops competing against continuous stimulation. People notice a subtle drop in tension when they step into a quiet room after prolonged noise exposure. The change is not just psychological. Continuous sound, traffic, conversations, alerts, keeps the nervous system in a heightened alert state linked to sustained activation of stress pathways. The auditory system feeds directly into brain regions involved in threat detection, especially when stimulation is unpredictable. Over time, this constant input maintains a background level of physiological arousal that many people interpret as normal energy, even when it is actually mild stress. That arousal is closely tied to cortisol regulation. When sound levels remain high or inconsistent, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis can stay partially engaged, sustaining stress chemistry longer than necessary. Strategic silence interrupts that loop. With fewer external triggers, cortisol secretion patterns begin to normalize, allowing the body to shift toward repair-oriented processes. This is not immediate relaxation. It is a gradual recalibration of internal signaling, where the absence of noise becomes a measurable input that the endocrine system responds to over time. At a larger scale, silence activates the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which governs recovery functions like digestion, heart rate stabilization, and energy conservation. Heart rate variability often increases during quiet environments, a physiological marker associated with improved emotional regulation capacity. The body constantly alternates between sympathetic activation and parasympathetic recovery. Modern environments heavily bias that balance toward activation. Even low-level background noise in cities can prevent full transition into restorative states, keeping biological systems partially engaged in readiness mode. That imbalance affects long-term resilience. When recovery states are interrupted too frequently, emotional regulation becomes less efficient, and cognitive endurance declines under sustained pressure. Strategic silence helps restore the conditions needed for neuroplastic adaptation, where the brain reorganizes pathways associated with focus and stress response. Repeated exposure to quiet environments strengthens the system's ability to return to baseline after stimulation. Over time, this does not eliminate stress, but improves the speed and stability of recovery, which is a key component of psychological resilience in high-stimulation environments. People tend to feel more anxious when they wait for someone else to solve a problem. The uncertainty creates a rising internal pressure that is easy to recognize in everyday situations, like delayed responses or unclear instructions. This reaction is not just emotional hesitation. It reflects activation in stress regulation systems that respond to perceived lack of control. When outcomes depend on external approval or intervention, the brain increases vigilance, scanning for cues that might reduce uncertainty but rarely finding them quickly enough to fully stabilize attention. That instability is closely tied to cortisol dynamics. When the brain interprets a situation as uncontrollable, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis can sustain elevated cortisol release, reinforcing a loop of stress anticipation. Radical self-reliance interrupts this loop by shifting control back to internal decision-making. Once a person begins acting immediately, testing solutions, making choices, correcting errors in real time, the brain receives feedback that reduces uncertainty. This feedback engages prefrontal regulatory systems, which help inhibit excessive stress signaling from limbic structures like the amygdala. As self-directed action repeats over time, the nervous system adapts. Repeated exposure to controllable stressors builds what researchers often describe as stress inoculation, where the body becomes more efficient at returning to baseline after activation. Heart rate variability tends to improve, and cortisol spikes become shorter in duration rather than sustained. This does not mean stress disappears. It means the biological response becomes more proportional to the actual challenge instead of the perceived lack of control. The system learns through repetition that action produces resolution. That learning changes long-term emotional stability. When individuals consistently rely on their own problem-solving capacity, neural pathways associated with executive function strengthen, while reactive stress loops weaken. Over time, the brain becomes less sensitive to uncertainty itself and more responsive to actionable information. In environments filled with rapid decisions and unpredictable inputs, this shift reduces cognitive fatigue because fewer resources are spent on prolonged worry states. Self-reliance, in this sense, is not independence for its own sake, but a mechanism that gradually recalibrates how the brain assigns stress to problems that can actually be solved. Thank you for watching this episode on Relaxing Facts Studio. If you found value in this exploration of solitude, independent thinking, and the science behind how the mind works, please subscribe if you haven't already. Your support helps keep this channel producing in-depth documentary content like this. If you enjoyed it, please like the video so it can reach more people who may benefit from it. Share it on your social media pages to expand the conversation. And leave a comment with your thoughts. What ideas stayed with you, and how you interpret them. Your engagement is essential for the channel's continued growth and operation.